All right, so we're off. I don't have a clue, but I am super nervous. It seems like I'm getting more nervous before each video. I don't understand why, but once I get rolling, I'm good. So today's video, per the title, is DNA Expert Part 2. I emailed him about a week ago and he finally got back in touch with me. If you haven't seen DNA Part 1 on my channel, I would advise you to watch it. And there's a bunch of good information on there that's going to tie in to this second part. So if you haven't, like I said, please go watch that. Now, this video is going to be long. Obviously, I understand if you can't stick around for the whole thing, but I would advise you to come back at some point and finish watching where you left off because it's a bunch of good information. So, the first question that I asked him, and I believe Miss Linda is the one who wanted me to ask this question. Maybe another person too. There might have been a couple of people. So here it goes. If the lab contaminates a sample from a crime scene with one of its workers' own DNA, would the protocol be to not make a conclusion on that sample? I understand deviations, but what is the SOP, standard operating procedure? That's what I asked him. His answer was there are no universal standard operating procedures for DNA testing labs. Each lab will have its own standard operating procedure. In my experience, a small majority would set aside results from a sample where there had been obvious contamination from someone associated with the lab. But it really could go either way, and it is dependent on the lab in question. Okay. So, self-explanatory. He's saying that it depends on the lab. They all have their own procedures that they follow. But with question one, I want to revert back to an article that I covered the other day. And this is what it says. And this question resulted from, as we all know, Making a Murderer. She contaminated the sample when the bullet was being tested, and she requested deviation to use the results anyway, blah, blah, blah. So the article that I referenced and I talked about the other day, it says clearly right here, the bullet reportedly had Halbach's DNA on it, but this evidence should not have been admissible in court because the control sample was contaminated by the forensic analyst. Despite the contamination deeming the evidence inadmissible, a one-time exception to the rule was filed by the analyst and granted by the court. So it clearly says right there that this was supposed to be inadmissible evidence because the sample was contaminated. But it says a one-time exception to the rule was filed by the analyst and granted by the court. So, to go with his answer to the question, it's safe to assume from all of this information that technically the sample and the conclusions from that sample were not typically, hardly ever allowed in a courtroom. But the deviation was filed and it was granted by the court. So, and a lot of this, is recovering some information. So you just have to bear with me if you're familiar with a lot of this. And I'm going to get into detail. I'm saving the long question for last because it's very important. And I'm going to break down details of certain things within that question. Question number 2, how accurate would DNA be able to draw a conclusion if only 7 out of 16 markers were able to be identified? He says, by markers, I bet you mean loci and not alleles. Loci, I've found out I'm not an expert in DNA, so I'm probably going to say some things wrong. I took biology in high school, loved science all through high school, took biology and different sciences in college, but I'm going to mess some of this stuff up. You just have to try to understand. So loci is plural. Locus would be a spot on the gene or on the DNA. For almost 20 years, now this is him talking, for almost 20 years, all labs were looking at just 13 loci, but in the past few years, there have been a switch to as many as 21. There are 2 different ways to go about answering your question. Number 1, incomplete information means literally that locus dropout has occurred. If locus dropout has occurred, then the allelic dropout may well have also occurred at loci where alleles were detected. The possibility of allelic dropout is a problem with any sample, but is a devastating problem for mixtures, to the point that no reliable conclusions can be drawn. Number 2, the second part to his answer. The less information available, the less impressive the statistical weights will be. Instead of numbers in the quintillions, they may be in the millions or even the thousands. But that assumes that the results can be reliably interpreted in the first place. Okay, so I misread something. But that assumes that the results can be reliably interpreted in the first place. And that can't be done for mixtures where dropout may have occurred. So, in the show, speaking specifically about the tissue that was left on the shin bone of Teresa Halbach, Sherry Culhane, in the PowerPoint presentation, put this up. So essentially, your genetic markers on the left-hand side, these are loci or locations on the chromosome which they check. In this particular one, it's 16 different things that they're cross-referencing to her known DNA profile. If you notice the ones that match, that's the ones that obviously they were able to get profiles of and match supposedly to Teresa Halbach. In the middle column, the ones that's missing, those are loci that has fell out of the sample. Okay. So those are the ones that were not able to be matched because they were not there. So only 7 of these 16 was able to be matched, which is about 43%. Now, this expert that we're talking to, and by the way, I forgot, if you want to hear his credentials, I didn't want to read them out in this video because it takes too long. In DNA Part 1, this expert that I'm talking to, all of his credentials are listed in that video. So 7 of these 16 markers, only 7 were able to be identified. Obviously, the one at the bottom, X, that indicates that it's a female. And this roughly comes up to about 43%. So obviously, if you was able to match every single one, then the statistical weight would be higher, because then you could undoubtedly say this sample is Teresa Halbach. And it very, very well may be. But if you look at the absence of markers that they wasn't able to identify, well, then your statistical weight drops dramatically. So instead of quintillions, this was Teresa Halbach's shin bone, 1 in quintillion. This could be now 1 in a billion or 1 in a million that this was Teresa Halbach. So it's very important that you understand, and I'm sure most of you do, that the less you can match, obviously, is less statistical weight. So, another question was, please advise on shutter status. What variables come into play? He said there are suggestions that some people shed cells more than others do. There are also suggestions that an individual's shutter status can change with time, possibly even from one moment to the next. Saliva is a very good source of DNA. One theory that I think is plausible is that shutter status is determined largely by how much you have touched your face since the last time you've washed your hands. So essentially, he's saying that if you had clean hands, you washed your hands, and you didn't touch certain parts of your body, and this goes back to the part 1 video, that if you touch certain items, touch what, your normal touch DNA that's going to come off your hands without touching your mouth and other things, one fingerprint, if you just touch something one time, you're typically going to get about 0.65 nanograms of DNA on what you just touched. Typically a lot less, as we'll talk about in a little while. So, but if you're touching your mouth, if you're touching your nose, if you're touching these types of things and you haven't washed your hands, then obviously you're going to leave more DNA on what you touch. So this all plays into my next question, which is going to take a while to talk about. So, and this is the broad point of what this video is about. Have you ever opened the hood of your car? This is me asking him the question, obviously. Have you ever opened the hood of your car? If so, you realize that when you reach under the hood to touch the hood release, your finger is only on it for 1 second. And the surface of the release is very smooth. As you have told me in the past, 0.65 nanograms is one fingerprint worth of DNA. So if you touch something like we just talked about, 0.65 nanograms. How many nanograms do you think you would leave on the hood release for touching it for 1 second? Under the assumption that shutter status is moderate to high. So here's his answer. He says there are very large number of variables that come into play. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to be breaking down these variables so you can decide for yourself. So here's the variables that he's talking about. Abrasiveness, moisture levels, temperature, the individual's cleanliness, vigor of contact, how rough are you handling the item, and the length of the time that you're touching the item. Such that it is not possible to give a very specific answer to your question. The complexity of the problem has contributed to there being very little scientific research on the topic. That does not help. Saying that a typical fingerprint has about 0.65 nanograms is about the best we can do. Vigorous, prolonged contact with a rough surface by someone who has not washed their hands in a while would be expected to leave behind more DNA. But there are no guarantees. So, let's break down some of these variables. Now, I'm sure all of you at some point has opened the hood to a vehicle. So, on the inside, when you pop the hood, you go outside, you stick your hand in, there's a latch. You put your finger on it for literally 1 second. I actually made a video. I have a video demonstrating this in the past. You touch that hood latch for 1 second, it clicks, you lift the hood up. So the specific variable in length of contact, you're literally touching it for 1 second. Okay? You're not sitting there rubbing it. You're not sitting there spitting on it. You're not doing any of these things, you literally touch it for 1 second, boom, it's done. And you don't touch it when you go to shut the hood. You just grab it and you shut it. So the vigor of contact was another variable. How rough are you handling the item? You're not handling it very rough at all. Okay. Every one of you has touched a hood latch. It's smooth. It doesn't take very long. Okay. So the next one is the individual's cleanliness. So prosecution claims that, and it's probably why they claim, and this why Kratz emphasized so many times about how sweaty Steven Avery supposedly was. All of that aside, I'm quite sure that if you had somebody with sweat just dripping off of their hands, that and they touched a hood latch, that yeah, they're going to leave more DNA on the hood latch, even in that 1 second. But where the prosecution doesn't make sense is, well, he had gloves on, but he took his glove off to touch the hood latch. That don't make any sense. They claim that he's bleeding through his glove, which is why he left the blood in the RAV, but there's no fingerprints anywhere on the car. There's no touch DNA anywhere on the RAV except the hood latch. So he went through all of these precautions to still leave blood, and then still took his glove off to touch something that the whole theory doesn't add up. And that is the purpose of what we're about to get into now. Don't get me wrong. In my DNA part 1 video, I talked to him and I asked, one of the questions I asked him was, how many nanograms do you think you'd get from a growing swab? As we all know, that a lot of people's theory is that think he's innocent is that the most easiest and most likely thing to have done is take the growing swab from the hospital, put it in an evidence bag, and label it hood latch. Okay? Because the growing swab was supposedly disposed of in the hospital because once the lady took the sample, they said, well, it's not on the warrant, so we don't need it. Supposedly she disposed of it. Okay? He said if you swabbed your growing, you get about 2 to 3 nanograms of DNA. There was 1.8 nanograms on the hood latch. So right at 2 nanograms. Remember, one fingerprint is 0.65. So there's 3 times higher the amount of DNA on the hood latch than what's reasonably expected. Okay? So don't get me wrong. I believe that the most likely thing that happened was they relabeled the growing swab, and they never even swabbed the hood latch. There's not even any discoloration on the swabs. Okay, you have oil and grease and dirt and dust, all of these things under the engine compartment of a RAV or any vehicle, and this cotton is perfectly white that supposedly came in contact with the hood latch. So don't get me wrong. I think they relabeled the growing swab, but here's what I want to do. I can't prove that they relabeled the growing swab, but what I want to attempt to do is discredit the notion that the state swabbed the hood latch and got 1.8 nanograms of Steven Avery's DNA. So that's why I'm focusing on what the state said as opposed to a theory that I have no information to give you. So Kathleen Zellner, as we all know, did experiments in Making a Murderer where she had multiple people. First, they cleaned the hood latch of the RAV that she bought. They had people open it under different circumstances. Each time somebody would open it, they'd swab it. I want to say they did that about 15 times. And each time, I want to say, now don't quote me on this, but I want to say each time it was anywhere from between 0.30 nanograms of DNA to 0.60. So right around that one fingerprint mark of 0.65 or less. Nowhere near 1.8 nanograms of DNA. So the last two variables that come into play, and these are the ones that we're going to talk about the most, is abrasiveness. I can speak to this topic personally because of what I do for a living. So to give you a quick rundown, I am certified by NACE. NACE is a National Association of Corrosion Engineers. I have the highest certification in the coating inspection program. So I have personal knowledge of abrasiveness when it comes to steel substrates. When it comes to steel items, I can talk about this at length. So everybody's seen a picture of the hood latch, and most people's touched the hood latch. Nowadays, they have rubber on the hood latch. It's not metal anymore. I notice most vehicles, they put rubber on the hood latch, like a little rubber cap or something like that, just to, for comfort or whatever. I don't know. So it's smooth. It's metal. It's carbon steel, and it's metal. It has a very smooth coating on the hood latch. Keep in mind that when we're talking about smooth, you don't have a lot of abrasiveness. You don't have what we call in the industry an anchor profile. So if you're touching something smooth, you're going to leave less DNA than if you was touching something rough. That just makes sense. The rough surface is going to grab more cells off of your finger. So some of the analogies I gave in a previous video, and I've talked about this not in detail, but for instance, so I got off track there. Sorry, I was trying to fix something. So let's say you have a smooth surface. Like, for instance, why is this even important? Okay. Well, let's say in my industry that you're painting something. You can't just paint right over the steel that comes right from the manufacturer. Why? Because it's going to peel off. I'm sure all of you have got paint out of a bucket or left paint in a tray, and then the next day went back and peeled it out. Why does that paint stick to what you painted it on, but don't stick in the tray? It just peels right out because there's no abrasiveness. There's no surface profile. Example. Okay. This paint in this tray right here, it peels right out. There's no surface profile for the paint to stick to. In relation to what we're talking about, DNA, smooth surfaces are going to contain less DNA than rough surfaces. Okay. Why is this important? Well, if you imagine a pipeline, you can't have coating failure in a pipeline, especially buried pipelines. Okay. If you do, guess what? You're going to have corrosion, you're going to have rust, and then you're going to have leaks from that pipeline into the ground, around the surrounding environment, etc. Or you're going to have this. Okay. Explosions, etc. If you have it unchecked corrosion, if you have unchecked, if it's not mitigated, if it's not evaluated, there's a wide variety of different examples. So steel that is smooth, this is how it comes from the manufacturer. Unless you're buying it from overseas and you're buying cheap metal that ain't worth a crap. This is how it comes. So essentially, if you look at a picture of the hood latch, it's very smooth, just like this steel that you're looking at right here. So yeah, you can paint over this, but just like I just showed you in this picture, you can paint over it all day, but guess what? You're going to be able to peel the paint right off. So if you touch this pipe, you get DNA on it, but it's not going to stick very well. Now, if you take that pipe or any substrate, let's say, for instance, you took a piece of sandpaper and you sanded the hood latch and then touched it for a couple seconds. Well, then 1.8 nanograms of DNA is more feasible because you have abrasiveness, you have a rough surface that your hand is coming in contact with. The rough surface is going to grab a hold of more skin cells. And when, this is a better analogy here. So instead of having a surface that is completely smooth, like the hood latch, you would have a surface that looked like this. This is what it looks like under a microscope. So imagine if you touch this piece of illustration of steel, how much more DNA. See all of the peaks that's on this illustration? That is going to contain, that is going to grab a hold of more DNA. And it's not going to come off easy because it's going to be embedded in the surface profile. So if you touch the hood latch for 1 second, and you have these variables that we talk about, he touched the hood latch for 1 second, not rough at all, so the vigor of contact is not an issue. The length of contact is not an issue. To further demonstrate how ridiculous it is to believe that he left 1.8 nanograms of DNA on this hood latch is the abrasiveness. There's no way. This hood latch is very smooth. It's not going to grab a hold of those cells. Now, the next thing is moisture levels. Now, this is one thing I wanted to elaborate on a little more. So, moisture levels. The hood latch is steel. Okay. Anytime you have steel and the surface temperature outside. Now, keep in mind, once this vehicle, let's just say, is sitting outside and it acclimates to its environment, everything on that vehicle, for the most part, that's steel, is going to fluctuate with the temperature of the environment. So if it gets hot, the steel is going to warm up. So your surface temperature and your air temperature, once an item is acclimated, is going to be almost identical. When you get dew on a steel surface, that is a result. So anytime, let's say your surface temperature is on this piece of steel is 50 degrees, and your dew point is, anytime your dew point is within 5 degrees of the surface temperature of a piece of steel, you're going to get dew that forms on the steel. Okay? It won't always look like this. It's very possible, and it happens all the time where I work, that you won't see any visible moisture on the surface, which is why you have to check it. But it's a scientific fact that if you have a steel substrate, any type of steel, in this case, the hood latch, and the surface temperature and the dew point temperature is within 5 degrees of each other, there's moisture on the surface. Whether it's visible or not, there's moisture on the surface. Now, in this, the DNA expert talks about moisture is one of the key factors that degrade samples. Okay, and I also did a video where I talked about, from the Journal of Scientific Forensic Research or whatever, it talked about temperature and moisture, how it degrades biological samples. It degrades DNA samples. Okay, so keep in mind that this vehicle, the RAV4, set outside presumably. I think regardless of what end of the spectrum you're on or how you think about it, as far as guilty, innocent, or who did this or who did that, regardless how you think about it, the RAV4 that was found on Stephen Avery's salvage yard set in the weather outside somewhere, whether it was on the property or not at the time, is set outside in the environment from October 31st till November the 5th. So I had some very nice people hook me up with some information of the weather conditions in those dates. And it's kind of hard to see, but it has from October 30th to November the 5th. Now, what's interesting to note here is that every single one of those nights, so for instance, when the sun goes down, the steel is going to start cooling. Okay? Your dew point starts rising. Hence, when you wake up in the morning, sometimes, not all the time, but when you go outside, you go to your vehicle, there's moisture all over your vehicle, all over the windshield, etc. Each one of the nights that this vehicle supposedly had Steven Avery's DNA on the hood latch, each one of these nights, so when the sun went down, say a couple hours after the sun went down, that time of year, probably 5:30. So let's say by 7:30, once that dew point rises within 5 degrees of the surface temperature, it's already acclimated. So, and it doesn't matter that it's under the hood. See, that's a misconception that a lot of people have. It does not matter that the latch is under the hood. It's acclimated. Therefore, once the dew point gets within 5 degrees of the surface temperature, you have moisture on it. A key degrader of a DNA sample. Each one of these nights, 31st, the 1st, the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, this RAV sat out there in the weather. Each one of these nights, that hood latch had moisture on it. You already have a smooth surface, so it's going to hold less. Now, when you start adding moisture into the equation, because the DNA doesn't have anything to grab a hold of, you have lifting. So as that hood latch starts to accumulate or produce moisture, any DNA that was on that already smooth surface now is being degraded, possibly even removed from the hood latch. So you can see right off the bat where I'm going with this. Okay. The DNA expert says that the variables that come into play are abrasiveness. It's very smooth. Moisture levels, temperature, the individual's cleanliness, vigor of contact, how rough he handled it, and the length of time. All of which, if you apply all of this knowledge, and this DNA expert, and I've mentioned this in the last video, he doesn't know what I'm asking these questions for. I'm giving him general questions, and he's giving me his unbiased opinion. He does not know why I'm asking these questions. He thinks I'm doing it for some kind of research or some kind of paper or something. So if you take the information that you acquire from people like this and you apply it to the prosecution's theories, as we have and we all have in almost every single piece of forensic evidence available, it's the only consistent factor within all of these pieces of evidence is that they don't add up and they don't make sense. The prosecution wants you to believe that after the sample degraded. Now, keep in mind, this hood latch wasn't swabbed immediately. It was a long time after the RAV4 was found before this hood latch was swabbed. So not only do you have time and different environmental conditions, you have 5 days for sure that close to 12 hours each time the sun went down, this hood latch was collecting moisture at night drying up during the day, wants to still heat it back up. And the prosecution wants you to believe that they were still, at the time they were able to swab, they were still able to get 3 fingerprints worth of DNA off of something that Steven Avery touched, supposedly, and I'm just telling you their theory, for 1 second. I can't prove that they took the growing swab and relabeled it as hood latch swab. But if you take all of the information that is out there and you sit down and you start adding it up, once again, this is a very thought out explanation of how this cannot be feasible. If it was the steering wheel, for instance, and they claim that they swabbed it and got 1.8 nanograms of his DNA off the steering wheel, that's believable. If they swabbed the gear shift and they said that we got 1.8 nanograms of touch DNA from the gear shift, that's believable. It's rough. It has more of a profile. He'd be touching it multiple times, but there's none of that. There's no touch DNA anywhere on the vehicle. There's not a single fingerprint anywhere on the vehicle. The blood, as talked about in other videos, is clearly planted. The spot by the ignition, 1,000%, in my opinion, is put on with the applicator. So my goal is and always is to discredit the information that the theory of the state, how they laid this case out, is completely false. So it's quite frustrating, especially talking with people that think Steven Avery is guilty, to explain these types of things, because they don't even want to, they don't even want to entertain the thought that evidence could be planted. And the ones that do think that there's no possible way you could plant touch DNA evidence. Well, it's very easy. It's a relabeling technique. You take the swab that was disposed of in the hospital, put it in an evidence bag, write hood latch on it. It's that easy. So that's my breakdown. That's my second part of the DNA expert. If you have any more questions, it will not be soon, because as I mentioned before, I do not want to lose this guy as a person that will answer questions, so I don't want to bother him frequently. But if you have any more questions that you want to ask, that you want asked or answered, leave them in the comment section, and in a couple months, I'll bother him again after he forgets that I asked him, before, and we'll get some more questions answered. If you could think of something maybe that hasn't been thought of, that would help explain something. So that's going to be it for tonight. Please like this video, share this video. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do. And that's going to be it.